what we're going to be looking at is fixed overhead variance analysis here, but we're going to be looking at it in terms of selecting a different capacity level and how it affects our variances based on the capacity level that we have selected here. Okay, so with variance analysis here, you're really comparing your actual results for the period here versus some budgeted performance that you have established. All right, so when you're dealing with variances, you really have three different amounts that you have to be looking at here. And in our case, we would be starting with a static budgeted amount here. That's going to be some budgeted quantity here, in this case of our fixed overhead that we'd have, times some budgeted price we have for that fixed overhead amount. So that would be the static budget, and we'd set that up at the beginning of the period here, where we're going to be basing our production on that static budget. And then at the end of the period, you're going to have your actual results for the period, and that would be some actual quantity times some actual price here. In this case, we're dealing with our fixed overheads here. So that would be our actual results here for the period. And then the other item that we have to know is the flexible budgeted amount here. And this is the case here where we're going to have established some budgeted capacity here for the plant, and it's going to be based on what they call DH here, or denominator hours, and we're going to be looking at that. And we take that capacity level here that we have established times some budgeted price. The budgeted price would be coming off our static budget here. But this capacity, the denominator hours, we're going to be looking at it because we're going to be basing our capacity here in terms of direct labor hours. That we're going to have to establish. Okay, so what you would do here for the variance analysis, you would have compare your actual, your flexible, and your static amounts. And let's just do that here, and then we'll go down and look at our capacity selection. Capacity level selection. So for our fixed overhead, we're going to have a spending variance and we're going to have a volume variance. And the spending variance is really the difference between in this case, it's going to be based on direct labor hours. It'll be the actual hours that we use times some actual fixed overhead right here. And then our flexible amount, this is what we're going to have to deal with, those denominator hours here times some budgeted fixed overhead right here. So comparing our flexible and actual amount is just the difference between the two. That'll be our spending variance. And we're going to be looking at these in terms of a graph to understand what they are. And then our volume variance, that's going to be the difference between our flexible and our static amount. And that flexible amount, those are those denominator hours. Those are going to be the total budgeted direct labor hours here, because we're going to be using our direct labor hours as our overhead allocation base. So we would take those total direct labor hours and compare it to the static budgeted hours allowed here. The common factor here is the budgeted fixed rate overhead rate here between the flexible and static amount. So you can factor that out. So volume variance is just the difference between the denominator hours here versus the budgeted hours that we've allowed for the period. That difference times the budgeted fixed rate here. Okay, so that's for our volume variance. Okay, before we go in and look at our graph, let's go and understand how we selected these denominator hours, or these DH here. All right, going down here, we're going to be working off this key here, this reference key. I talked about this AF here. That was our actual fixed overhead rate. And really, we'll start with that here. But those would be taking our total actual fixed cost here for the period and divide them by, in this case, we're using our allocation basis as direct labor hours here. This is how we're going to allocate our fixed overhead here. And total actual direct labor hours. So that would be our actual fixed overhead rate. The budgeted fixed overhead rate, well, that's our total budgeted fixed cost that we have for the period divided by our total direct labor hours, our allocation base that we budgeted for the period. So that would be a budgeted fixed overhead rate. The actual hours used would be, in this case, is based on direct labor hours. Those are the actual direct labor hours that we've used. And then BHA here in blue is the budgeted hours that we've allowed here based on our budget. And here is those DH, those total budgeted direct labor hours. Those are the denominator hours here. They're called the denominator hours because they're in the denominator here of our allocation, looking at our total fixed cost versus our total direct labor hours, the denominator hours. And that's really our capacity that we're going to be looking at. Okay, so we have really four different selections we can make here for this budgeted fixed overhead rate here based on those total. Our total fixed cost, that's going to be constant regardless of the total direct labor hours or the denominator hours we make our selection on. Okay, so let's go up and let's look at what we have to select from here. So for capacity utilization definitions, the different choices, we really got 4 of them here. We'll start out with our theoretical capacity. That's where the production of the output is 100% of the time. 100% of the time your plant is producing here. Then we get down to our second selection. That would be the practical capacity. And incidentally, this is the one that we really should be working off, this practical capacity here. That's where the maximum level of a plant can operate efficiently, and it allows for unavoidable interruptions such as repair time or waiting time. But that's really the capacity level that you're going to want to work off. And then for our normal capacity, the third choice here would be, this is where less than 100% of our practical capacity up here, and it will satisfy the average customer demand over a long-term span. And it includes seasonal, cyclical, and trend factors. And when we talk about long-term span, we're talking about years out into as many as 5 years out here. Determining our normal capacity would satisfy customer needs into the future here as far as 5 years out. Then we get down to our master budget. That's the anticipated level of capacity utilization for the next year or the planning period for the master budget. And the capacity results in the product cost that is neither consistent nor accurate when production activities differ between periods. That's just looking, it's not keyed around the capacity level of the plant. It's whatever the sales department and the rest of the company feels they're going to be selling within the next current period, within the next year here. Okay, so we've got these 4 different levels to choose from, but we're going to be looking at our theoretical, our practical, and our normal capacity in our calculations. Okay, so going back to our little equation here where we take our total fixed cost and divide them by our total direct labor hours. That's our allocation basis we're using for our fixed overhead rate here. Okay, so let's look at them here. Let's just look at what we'd be looking at. So for our capacity levels, let's just say for our theoretical capacity level, this is the case where, just say our total fixed cost, they're set at $1 million a year here for the plant. Now, in theory, we're saying we can produce at 110,000 direct labor. At 110,000 direct labor hours here, we can produce at that. That's the all-out capacity here of the plant. 100% production rate here in the plant. So $1 million divided by 110,000 direct labor hours is $9 per hour here for our fixed overhead rate. Just looking at it on that basis. Now, the practical capacity, instead of 110,000, we say, well, 100,000, we can produce at 100,000 direct labor hours here, effective production for the plant. Again, divided by the same fixed overhead rate here of $1 million is going to give us $10 per hour here in our overhead rate. So theoretically, we could produce at $9, or we would be costing or applying our rate here at $9 per hour, but practically it's going to be $10 per hour here for a fixed overhead rate. And just throwing these numbers out here just for comparison purposes. Now we get down to our normal capacity. That's really our long run capacity that we'd be looking at. And again, same fixed rate here, $1 million, but we're going to say we can only produce at 90,000 direct labor hours here. And that's going to give, that division is going to give us $11, our applied or our budgeted fixed overhead rate would be here. So you can see, theoretically, our budgeted fixed overhead rate here is lower because we said we could produce at a greater amount of, in this case, our allocation basis direct labor hours. We could produce at 110,000 direct labor hours here. Practically, we're saying now we can only put out at 100,000 direct labor hours. So that increases our rate here on our overhead applied rate here for our overhead. And then normal, we're saying, well, really 90,000 hours. Divided again by the same fixed cost. So that increases our overhead rate again here. Now, I didn't put in the master budgeted amount. The master budgeted amount could probably fall within any of these ranges, either above or below or within that range here. But I'm just using these 3 amounts here. Okay, so let's go and let's look at our variance analysis based on these different capacity levels here. All right. So let's go back to our graphical analysis, what we're going to be using here. And this is the graph it's laid out here. I've got along our x-axis here, or our lower amounts here, or lower part of our graph, those are the direct labor hours here. That's our allocation base here. So we're going to have some budgeted hours allowed here, actual hours used for the period, and then we have that capacity amount, those denominator hours here. And remember, that range from 110,000 down to 90,000, depending on it. But just in terms of, those would be our hours, direct labor hours, our allocation base along our bottom axis here. Then along our y-axis here, or that's our overhead cost. And that's going to be some budgeted, in case, some fixed rate of overhead times some actual hours that we've budgeted or allowed for the period here. And there'd be, based on some budgeted and actual amounts, you're going to come up with some overhead costs. But what we have here on our graph is this. We have this upward sloping green line here. That's going to be based on our some applied budgeted rate. So that is going to be that budgeted fixed rate that we calculated here. That was the normal, their total fixed cost divided by its total direct labor hours. In this case, it's whatever we selected here. Our capacity level, let's just say we're looking at that practical capacity level. So we would take that budgeted fixed rate times the direct labor hours. So this is our applied, based on our applied budgeted rate, we'd be using so much fixed overhead here. But then we have the other point we have here is along this constant line here. That's our fixed overhead rate here. That's based on that budgeted fixed rate times those total those denominator hours that we have here. So that is our constant amount across here. And just say it's based on, you would want to do it based on some practical capacity here. Okay, so now we get to, that's the lines we have, and then we're going to be looking at, we're going to have some budgeted hours. Okay, first off, maybe we better go and we have to look at our actual cost here. And what we have here, based on the actual hours used, we're going to have some actual price here. We're going to hit our fixed rate here, or our fixed amount. We're going to have some budgeted price here, excuse me. It's going to be budgeted fixed rate here. When we talk about budgeted price, I'm talking about the fixed rate here. So when we hit this blue line, based on our actual hours used, we're going to be looking at the budgeted fixed rate here versus the actual fixed rate here. So our actual cost here is our actual fixed rate times the actual hours used here. And this is key here, because what we're going to be doing here is we're going to be looking at our budgeted hours allowed, our actual hours used, and those denominator hours here. And this is where we're going to set up our spending and volume variances here. Okay, so let's just do that here. Let's do it based on the budgeted hours allowed. So what we're going to place on the budgeted hours allowed, we're going to take that applied rate here, the budgeted fixed rate, times some direct labor hours here based on those budgeted hours allowed. We hit our green line here, move across to our y-axis here. So that overhead cost is going to be the budgeted fixed rate here times the budgeted hours allowed here. Now the actual hours used, this is where we come up to, and we're going to be looking at the intersection here based on where it intersects our fixed blue line here. So we move across here, and that's going to again be the budgeted fixed rate times some denominator hours here. We're going to be looking at that. And the reason we want to look at that is because this is what we're going to call the volume variance here. And that the volume variance is really the difference between the budgeted hours allowed and the actual hours used based on our points here, based on where actual hours used intersects with our blue line here, and the budgeted hours allowed intersects with our green line. So between the fixed rate here and those budgeted hours allowed here, that cost times the budgeted fixed rate, that's our volume variance. And then the spending variance, that's simply looking at the difference between the budgeted fixed rate here and the actual fixed rate. That's your spending variance. But our capacity level that we're looking at in this case was that practical capacity level, and that's the budgeted fixed rate that we have times the denominator hours. Now remember, the budgeted fixed rate here was based on the denominator hours divided into the total fixed cost. that you have for the period. Okay, so those are our spending and volume variances. And then the other thing here is where our applied budgeted rate here intersects with our fixed amount here. That is the intersection. That would be our direct labor hour, denominator hours here on our green line, where it intersects with our fixed blue line here, only to make that point. And the slope here of that green line is the budgeted fixed rate, and that's any point on that was the applied budgeted fixed rate. So that intersection here with our fixed with our budgeted fixed rate times the denominator hour should intersect with our budgeted fixed rate times the direct labor hours here, only to make that point here. Okay, so the key is here when we talk about these volume variances here, anything any hours actually used above your budgeted hours allowed here would be an unfavorable variance here, and a favorable variance here would be anything below it. But with the volume variance, really what you're looking at is this intersection point here. Anything below, the difference between anything below this volume variance here, between your blue line, anything below it, and what you intersect with your green line here, that would be an underapplied variance here. So that would be an unfavorable variance. Any point here on your applied budgeted rate, if you landed here and compared it with the fixed rate, that would be a favorable amount here because you would have overapplied your amount here. Okay, so nonetheless here, we just wanted to understand what the spending and volume variances were based on and just say our practical budgeted amount. Okay, so now let's go up and let's look at the case here. Now, we talked about those three different theoretical, the practical, and the normal amount here. If we lay those out, and that was our different capacity levels. If we lay them out in our graph here, you can see that we're going to have, along our allocation basis here for direct labor hours, we're going to have, again, budgeted hours allowed, actual used, but we're going to have three different rates we can select from. We're just going to do the comparison here. Remember those denominator hours? That was that practical amount here. And went across to that fixed amount here, budgeted fixed rates and the denominator hours. Now, if we lay that out here, with those, looking at the theoretical, the practical, and the normal amounts, they're going to change on our allocation basis here for direct labor hours. The normal amount here is going to be less than the denominator hours that we used. The denominator hours that we had here was based on that practical capacity of 100,000 here. Now, the normal was based on 90,000 direct labor hours. The plant can produce at 90,000 direct labor hours here, so that's less than that. And by doing that here, you got, not only do you have the changes here along your x-axis here where you have your hours allocation between your normal, practical here, theoretical, we didn't look at that, it was 110,000 hours, DH1 here. You're also going to have the different slopes of your lines here, your applied rate here. We looked at that green line, that was based on the practical amount, that was the budgeted fixed rate times the direct labor hours here. Now the theoretical amount, that's going to be this line here. It's going to be a budgeted fixed rate, the first budgeted fixed rate we have here, and that was because we were basing it on greater denominator hours or greater hours allocated here. The basis was greater. We use 110,000 hours here versus the 100,000 here. We have a lower applied rate here. That was $9 per hour here we were applying at our overhead rate here versus our practical amount here was $10 per hour. So what we have here is two things going on here. We've got this lower applied rate here. You can slope of the lines lower here than our theoretical amount that we have. And we also have difference here on our costing basis along our x-axis here. Our practical amount here was the budgeted fixed rate times the denominator hours, those first ones we used here. But because we now have a lower, our budgeted fixed rate here is lower than for our theoretical, our budgeted fixed rate is lower. So we're going to, the denominator hours here, we're going to have a different line here. Our fixed rate's also changing here. All right. And the same thing for our normal amount. I don't want to go into it too deeply here. But our normal amount was less than our practical amount, 90,000. So that's going to bring our slope of our line here, our application rate, it's going to be greater than the practical amount here. In the practical amount, we were applying at $10 per hour. Now, normal amount here, we have to go up to $11 an hour times the direct labor hours here. But it also changes our fixed amount here that we have to work off of here, fixed amount. The DH2 here, based on there's no new fixed rate here. So we have what's going on here for when you're changing those denominator hours here, theoretical, practical, and normal, you have to come up with a different application rate here for each of those. And it also changes your fixed amount as well here. So you have to come up with a new graph. And just the point is here, you can see the volume variance, the difference here. Remember that was based on our budgeted amount here versus whatever we had for our fixed amount here. You can see it with, I'm not going to go through them all, but there's a different range here. Theoretical was lowest, and the normal amount here had a higher volume variances. And then our spending variance, the only thing, everything stays the same in this case. The actual fixed rate and the actual hours used, that actual cost stays the same. But depending on the denominator hours we choose here, you're going to have different spending variances. So it depends where your fixed amount, that's going off your fixed amount here to your actual spending. And you can see here between the theoretical, you get a greater spending variance here than the normal amount here, because your normal, you have a different fixed rate here and everything. It gets a little busy here, but the point is here. When you're working with these different allocation bases and denominators, you're going to come up with your graph. You're going to have to come up with whatever you establish here on your rate per your allocation basis. In this case, it was direct labor hours. And then you're going to also have to determine how your fixed amount is, the constant fixed amount is for the period. So you're applying it at your fixed overhead rate at a certain amount here, and you also have a constant amount of your fixed overhead rate here at a certain amount. And I guess maybe that's where we want to stop here. And then based on that, you can go back and you can determine your volume variances and your spending variances. But everything is based on this capacity utilization and how you select. In this case, we're working with our denominator hours here. If you selected a theoretical amount here, that's where you're putting out 100% of the time here. And you actually had a lower per rate cost here. Practical amount was in between both our normal and our theoretical. Normal is a little less than the practical amount here, but nonetheless you're coming up with some different different amounts here that you're applying those fixed overheads at rates. And then you also have to look at how that affects your constant or your fixed overhead. Okay, so maybe this is where we'll stop here, and this is where we can get a better understanding here of how we base our different capacity levels here and how it affects our volume and our spending variances.